has no real power. And
but if the vice president assumed some of the presidential powers, could Mubarak remain in name? Just one moment. Could he remain in name the president, even if he were not effectively running the country? Would that be a compromise you were willing to accept?
The vice president has to assume all power, and in the same time, in a parallel way, the vice president has to accept to nominate a new prime minister in charge of a transitional government that will represent the whole political spectrum in the country. This is, I would accept, and I might be able to convince some of those who are calling for the change. But if you don't have power delegation from the president, and if you don't have a real independent government to run the transitional period, I will not trust the government. I will not trust the regime if he has the whole power to run the transitional period. This is something a major. This has to be very clear to the ongoing regime.
One final question to you, Professor. You were involved with the National Association for Change. You don't want to talk about the personal politics that led you to resign from that, but is it your impression that there is a cohesive body of different opposition groups that can negotiate either with the Vice President or the Prime Minister?
Well, this is not the real issue. The real issue is with whom to negotiate. The real issue is the regime and the government, especially the vice president, has to present to the opposition a clear idea.
No, listen, I'm sorry, it is a very important point. I mean, is there anybody, any one group that's going to go to the government and say, this is what we want, this is what we're prepared to compromise on? Or are so many different groups coming from so many different angles that nobody knows?
Yeah, the issue is that we have the impression that they are just trying to buy time. You have the so-called SAJ committee, and I will even accept the SAJ committee, and I don't care who is inside it. But the issue that I will really consider the package that will be accepted by the government. This is for me the most important thing, because we all know that the opposition in Egypt are divided and so on, but they are united on something. They toppling the regime. We don't want to see President Mubarak anymore as the head of the state, and we want that the vice president became convinced that there is a change of regime, and we have to have a transitional period and have free elections, and the free elections will bring about the people that are needed and are voted for by the people itself. So,
Professor Nafea, thank you very much indeed. That's Professor Hassan Nafea, who was high up within the National Association for Change, which is led by Mohammed al-Baradei, and no longer part of that group, but he says part of the movement for change nonetheless. I want to go back to Omar Ashur, our lecturer in the politics of the modern Arab world. He's in London for us, teaches at Exeter University in the southwest of England. I mean, you were listening to that. However many times I asked him whether there was any kind of cohesion among opposition parties, he skirted around it, the impression being that there probably isn't.
Well, first, there's a problem with even the offer he mentioned. Mainly because the president, I think, according to some sources in the opposition, there was this offer for them that the president delegates his powers to the vice president, to Omar Suleiman. But there is an article in the Constitution, Article 136, that basically says that he can revert this at any time. So he can delegate the power to a vice president, and then he can promise a transitional period. And after the demonstration disbands, he can make a very hardcore security measure to secure Tahrir Square, and then we're back to square one again. And this happened before in Egyptian history. In February 1954, more than 1 million demonstrators surrounded Nasser's Abdin Palace, surrounded Jamal Abdel Nasser and Mohammed Najib in Abdin Palace, demanding a return of the military to their barracks and a civilian rule and reinstating the parliament and release of political prisoners. And Nasser's promised them to do so, just a promise. One of the leaders of the demonstrators asked them to leave. They left. This leader, Abdul Qadir Ouda, was arrested in the same night and then later on executed in January 55. And since then, for 57 years, Egypt lost its freedom. So, I mean, those tricks, those promises, people don't trust Mubarak anymore. From 1981, he's been telling them, giving them promises and never delivering on them. 2005, he promised the emergency law will end. 6 years later, we still have the emergency law. Police brutality is on the rise. 1981, he said he will serve for 1 term to restore stability after the assassination of President Sadat. He never left. 30 years later, he's still there. So there is really mistrust. And the problem, the critical issue here is his departure. Because if he departed, the momentum that and the moral support that will give for that will give for the pro-democracy demonstrators, it will be unimaginable. And I don't think any of his followers, whether Omar Suleiman or others, will be able to withstand this momentum. We saw that in Tunisia after the removal of Ben Ali. What happened next, and then the removal of the interior minister, the foreign minister, the finance minister, all the faces that were associated with the old regime, with corruption and with repression, they fell down one by one once the head of the repressive regime went away. And I think this is what's uniting the opposition. It's the demands, not the leaders, really. There's no one leader, obviously, for this movement, but the demands are quite united.
The demands are, as you say, the same. But when the army realizes that there's going to be a loser in this, it will jump one way or the other, because the army is worried about its own survival as well. So how close are we to seeing the senior figures in the army say, OK, we've got to do this, or we've got to do that. We've got to back the president wholeheartedly, or we've got to support the demonstrators?
I think the longer the demonstrators stay in Tahrir Square, and there are more and more demonstrations in every governorate and city in Egypt, the more there are international pressures, especially with the US, that gives the Egyptian army 1.25 billion annually. The more there are international pressures flagging that there will be consequences, legal consequences for anyone in the army that would think that there will be a violent repression or massive killing for the protesters. The more this is happening, the more that the army will take the side of the protesters, and somebody within the army command will come to Mubarak and tell him, you served for 30 years, we can arrange a dignified exit for you, because this is what's all about until now, this psychological accommodation of Mubarak. That should happen sooner than later, because the longer he's staying, the more the likelihood of this situation turning into violence. And this is what everybody is trying to avoid right now.
Doctor, thank you very much indeed. Professor of the Modern Arab World at Exeter University, that's in the southwest of the United Kingdom. Now, Imran Khan's taking a look at what's happening out there, not just on TV, but also in other sources of information. What have you got?
That's right, plenty of reaction to the news that the head of the Army's Central Command has addressed protesters in Liberation Square. He asked the protesters to leave the square. That's set the web alight. Lots of reaction from people who say they're not going to go despite his plea. On the microblogging site Twitter, I get a sense that the protesters are increasingly worried about what exactly the Army's role is. Here's some of the more recent developments. Nadal is defiant about that message to leave from the head of the Army Central Command. He says, "How dare the Army General come to Tahrir Square and ask the protesters to leave? Who the hell is he?" And once again, the battle lines are being drawn. Despite the fact that the Army asked protesters to dismantle barricades, this tweet's from Arwa SM. Protesters calling for volunteers to be at the entrances to Tahrir. The entrances are more exposed than yesterday. And Ian in Egypt is worried with this message. The army's denying access to families with children, removing barriers. It's ominous. Of course, you can get all of the latest news and analysis on Egypt. You can just visit our website. The address is www.aljazeera.net/English. You can also follow our live blog, where you can watch the latest videos and updates throughout the day.
Do you get any sense, Imran, of when people are sort of increasing the amount of material they either put onto Twitter or other sites, what they refer to as chatter? Are there peak moments in the day, or when we saw this member of Central Command, the head of Central Command in the square, is it when something particular happens?
It's when something particular happens. We've seen a lot of instant reaction to